Hello there, football fans, and thank you for joining us here again today as we look at the 1980 Oakland Raiders, a team that, no matter what their outlook or prognosis was, weren't going to let anyone down, even their fans, because no one was expecting anything out of them. Makes it a lot more easier. But let's flash back. January 9th, 1977, the Oakland Raiders are Super Bowl champions for the first time, handing a heavy defeat to the Minnesota Vikings 32-14. Led by the unique and brilliant coaching prowess of the legendary John Madden, their reliable star quarterback Ken the Snake Stabler, as well as receiver Fred Biletnikoff, leading the way. Also, you had two of the all-time best offensive linemen, Art Shell and Gene Upshaw. You had Pro Bowl wideout Cliff Branch, tight end Dave Casper, and on the defensive side, linebacker Ted Hendricks, defensive back Willie Brown, and safety George Atkinson, to name a few. The team built a reputation that gained a following all across the nation. And the commander from up above was the controversial, sometimes loved, very often hated, but certainly infamous, Al Davis. Davis adopted the motto that the Raiders live by, just win, baby. And he was definitely instrumental in the team's mainstream crossover appeal. The way he marketed the team and presented them, Davis definitely had methods that caused a stir, mainly with the league as well, as his rivalry with Commissioner Pete Rozelle has been very well documented. Some say Davis was in over his head, a money-hungry hustler who was only seeing an agenda all his own. Others saw him as a martyr for being the one who had the guts to stand against the NFL and even some of their questionable practices. But even so, Davis would soon become an enemy to the people of the very town that once revered him. The Raiders looked like they could very well repeat as Super Bowl champions, but they lost to the Denver Broncos in the 1977 AFC Championship, and the team faltered even further. Many felt Davis wasn't making the best decisions. His antics off the field were having an effect on it as well. In 1978, the team would finish 9-7 and miss the playoffs for the first time since 1971. They'd lose running back Clarence Davis as well as Willie Brown to retirement. And strong safety George Atkinson would soon head to Denver. Biletnikoff would retire at the end of the season. But the biggest loss of them all was John Madden. The coach left the game at the age of just 42 years old, apparently pursuing a career in broadcasting. Yeah, right. What next? He becomes to face the biggest sports video game franchise in the world? I'd like to see that. In 1979, it was the same old song and dance, another middle-of-the-road season. Tom Flores, the team's longtime receivers coach, did all he could as head coach, but it was 9-7, no playoffs for the second straight year. And going into 1980, the team had bigger problems, that being Davis wanted to move the team to Los Angeles. Well, needless to say, Oakland natives were in an uproar over this, and Davis became public enemy number one in the town. The league, however, filed an injunction against Davis, and the war between he and the league, specifically Pete Rozelle, had been brewing. Their rivalry had dated back to the early days of the AFL-NFL merger. He then filed an antitrust lawsuit, Davis that is. The team's behind-the-scenes politics were get to the city of Oakland and its fans. Davis basically wanted renovations for luxury boxes to the stadium. There were other reasons, but that was one of the main ones. But he was not able to achieve this, hence the move to Los Angeles. The owners voted it down, 22-0, and the five other teams out of the 27-28 total abstained from voting. Davis still defied this and tried to move the team. Rozelle was not pleased, and Davis was now his biggest headache. The city of Oakland had been a sports haven in the 1970s. The A's were a dynasty, winning 5 American League West pennants in a row, and, not to mention, winning the AL pennant 3 years in a row and the World Series 3 years in a row. Even the Golden State Warriors managed to snag an NBA title back then as well. Oakland was the city of champions, as of course the Raiders we know took Super Bowl 11. However, the 1979-80 season, the Warriors were dead last in the West, and one of the worst teams in the league. The A's in 1979 had one of the worst seasons in team history, and of course the Raiders were looking a very middle-of-the-road club. It seemed as though Oakland was becoming dead in the water in sports. However, at least the A's looked to be improving by the fall of 1980 thanks to the hometown kid by the name of Ricky Henderson. Davis's decisions, however, were based on business, and you could see that when you look at it from a different perspective, but you can see the ire of the fans clearly. They don't give a shit about business, and they had one of the most devoted and loyal followings in the league. The Raiders after the 1979 season didn't give anyone any expectations. A team that could, quote-unquote, at best, possibly make the playoffs, according to many experts in 1980. But they felt the team lacked any real depth, and that Flores, while an important part of the Raiders coaching staff for many years now, had himself a Super Bowl ring as their receivers coach, some felt he didn't simply have what it took to be the head coach. There were some remnants, of course, in that Super Bowl team, and some great talent otherwise. You had Cliff Branch, who the year before had 844 yards, was still their top wideout. They still had a tremendous tight end in Dave Casper. Linebacker Ted Hendricks was named to the All-1970s Decade team at this point. Punter Ray Guy, who had actually had a streak of Pro Bowl selections ended in 1979, was still among the best in the league and also named to the All-Decade team. The Raiders' offensive line remained somewhat pretty good and still had the most of Super Bowl heroes Art Shell, again, All-Decade team, but his string of Pro Bowls also ended. That also, the criticism fell on Gene Upshaw as well, another All-Star and future Hall of Famer. He also had center Dave Dalby as well. He was still somewhat reliable. He also had Henry Lawrence, and he did have younger talent in Mickey Garvin, who joined the team not all that long ago. The Raiders, however, gave 12th most sacks in the league in 1979. Not great, but also not terrible. They were saying this O-line was aging. However, the Raiders still had the 7th best offense in the league in 1979, but were 24th in rushing. Mark Van Egan was a great blocking fullback and had 3 1,000-yard rushing seasons under his belt, but his production was down in 1979 with 818 yards. Still good, but not what they were hoping for. However, Flores and Davis do agree on something. They need a finesse running back. We mentioned Cliff Branch, still very impressive, and their Pro Bowl tight end Dave Casper, who accumulated 4 straight Pro Bowl and first All-Team Pro selections. One of the best in the game at his position, 6'4", 240 pounds, quick hands, and an efficient blocker. And of course, you had Ken Stabler. Ken the Snake Stabler, the hero of 1976, was still their quarterback. And he was beloved among the Oakland faithful. He was 6th in passing yards, 5th in TD passes, 4th in completions, and 2nd in completion percentage. And he's also 4th in passer rating. He's still at the top of his game. On defense, they slipped badly to 18th, 21st on the pass, and 20th against the run. However, even during their Super Bowl success, they didn't always have the strongest and most consistent defensive core. You had fan favorite John Mudasak, who led an otherwise stagnant defensive line that was 18th in the league in sacks. The linebacking core was strong. They still had the great Ted Hendricks, and joining him was the underrated Rod Martin, a mid-sized linebacker who was also effective on the pass rush, and 4-time Pro Bowler and longtime fan favorite Phil Vilipiano. And despite giving up many yards, they were good at snagging passes in the secondary, as they were 8th in league in interceptions in 1979, led by safety Mike Davis and a highly underrated cover man, and that was Lester Hayes, who was coming into his own. Monty Jackson, 1976 with the Rams, led the league in interceptions. He was now with the Raiders. Also free safety and another Raiders icon, 3-time Pro Bowler Jack Tatum was part of this group. But the secondary was simply good on paper, but not great according to some. And last year had special teams. Ray Guy is still one of the best punters in the league. And rookie kicker Jim Breach did okay, 10th in field goal percentage, but it's still not the most reliable kicker in the world. You take a look at this team and you can see why they're simply deemed middle of the road. Maybe they will, maybe they won't make the playoffs. Plus, Davis's inner turmoil behind the scenes with the league didn't stop him from making some big moves. And this one shook the core of Raiders fans. 5 days after the owners voted Davis's proposed move to LA down, he drew even more ire from Raiders fans. Trading a man that's deemed a god in the town of Oakland, Ken Stabler, one of the best quarterbacks in the game, for Dan Pastorini of the Houston Oilers. Many speculate this trade was very personal between Stabler and Davis. Pastorini, however, was a talented QB, but talented was pretty much all he was. A former first-round draft pick in 1971, had 9 seasons under his belt, all spent with the Houston Oilers. He obtained a Pro Bowl selection in 1975 and had come off starting 2 straight AFC championships, but the team lost both to the Pittsburgh Steelers, who went on to win the Super Bowl. His numbers don't compare to Stabler's whatsoever. His touchdown-interception ratio is not very good at all. His completion percentage is a mere average at best, with 51.9%. His last 2 seasons were pretty good, but the Oilers team was bolstered mainly by their phenomenal star running back, Earl Campbell. Basically talented as all Pastorini is indeed. Stabler was a million times more. Fans already want to lynch Al Davis as it was. They just added fuel to the fire. They then looked to improve their receiving core and made a huge deal. This one raised some eyebrows as well. Fan favorite linebacker Phil Vilipiano, who was also a part of that Super Bowl team, was sent to Buffalo to improve their defense, and they in return got Bob Chandler, a star wideout in return. Chandler had spent all 9 seasons of his career with the Bills, a 7th-round draft pick who worked his tail off to become an elite wideout. He had accumulated nearly 4,000 yards in receiving in his career, 34 touchdowns and 295 catches. He was second in catches in 1976 and 77, and was a second-team All-Pro in 1975 and 1977. However, his production had slipped in 1978 and missed most of the 1979 seasons. Raiders fans and experts were not overly impressed with this move either. 8 days later, on April 30th, they made another deal with the Houston Oilers. The Raiders sent Jack Tatum, their 3-time Pro Bowl safety, also from that Super Bowl team, to Houston. With two 7th-round draft picks in 1980 and 81, for running back Kenny King, the rookie who won the bench while Earl Campbell starred. King was used on special teams plays, but he only carried the ball 3 times in his whole rookie year. Again, Raiders fans and experts were not impressed. They just gave up one of their best and most popular players for an unproven running back who was a 3rd-round pick. Davis was angering people more and more. They felt he was sabotaging the team to satisfy his own needs in anger at the fact that he could not move to Los Angeles. Now, this trade took place on the day of the 1980 NFL Draft, and the Raiders' picks looked like, well, a so-so class. They produced just 3 Hall of Famers. Not every draft class is a winner, but I'll tell you right now, none of those Hall of Famers are with the Raiders. Their first-round selection at 15th overall was top-ranked QB in their draft, Mark Wilson of Brigham Young, who went on to play 8 seasons with the Raiders. And their QBs all in their 30s, it seemed like the right move. However, they missed out on Art Monk later on. The 2nd round, however, was a steal. Matt Millen, a linebacker out of Penn State. Kenny Lewis was next in the 5th round. He ended up being waived by the team during training camp. He played the next 4 seasons with the Jets. He was the first of 3 5th-rounders, neither of which panned out. Markham Barnwell had 1 good season. 8th rounder Kenny Hill, a safety out of Yale, played 10 NFL seasons and collected a couple Super Bowl rings. Nothing much to write home about the rest. This draft failed to excite the Raiders' faithful, but to be fair, neither teams in the NFL really got too much out of this one except for those few Hall of Famers and a handful of Pro Bowlers. The draft was done, but Davis was not. The Raiders sent a 6th-round draft pick in 1982 and a 5th rounder in 1983 to the San Francisco 49ers in exchange for defensive end Cedric Hardman, a move that actually angered 49ers fans, and not the base of the Raiders, really. Hardman was one of the best ends in the game, and he was what the Raiders needed. He has spent his entire 10 seasons with the 49ers, and even though sacks were unofficially recorded back then, the tally from statisticians now have him recording 108 sacks during 10 seasons. Not bad at all. And led the league in sacks in 1971. And in that year, as well as 1975, he was given a Pro Bowl selection. His production, however, slipped in 1979. And with the week before the season was about to begin, the Raiders didn't have any faith in kicker Jim Breach, so he was cut from the team. Then they signed Chris Barr, who recently departed the Cincinnati Bengals. He had some decent numbers, even though his field goal percentage wasn't always stellar, but he did make 70.4% of them in 1977. Some saw dropping Breach and obtaining Barr as just kind of pointless. So, yes indeed, Tom Flores and Al Davis had put together a team that was seen as, again, that word, middle of the road. Pundits said the Raiders are stuck in purgatory, pretty much. A typical, again, maybe they will, maybe they won't playoff bunch. San Diego Chargers, led by the great QB Dan Fouts, the most dangerous receiving corps in the league, was likely favored to take the AFC West. The season was set to begin September 7th at Arrowhead Stadium in Kansas City as the Raiders take on their division rivals, the Chiefs. The Raiders and Pastorini actually looked really good on opening day. The quarterback completed just above half his passes for over 317 yards, 2 touchdowns, and no picks. Bob Chandler also looked really good in his first game as a Raider, catching for 85 yards. And to Pastorini's credit, he utilized every member of his offense quite well. He was also sacked 4 times, however, which did bring a criticism to the offensive line. The Raiders' secondary was amazing, intercepting 3 passes. Pastorini then had his work cut out for him as he led the Raiders into another road game, this one in San Diego against the powerful Chargers. It was an exciting showdown where both teams' secondaries were utterly insane. The Raiders have 5 picks from 5 different players. But again, Pastorini throws costly incompletions. And the Raiders couldn't make every turnover count. And backup Jim Plunkett hit an 18-yard touchdown pass to Ray Chester to tie it for the Raiders for his one play of the game. But Fouts led his team on an overtime winning drive to take it 30-24. Pastorini, however, was still good at spreading out passes against different receivers. Their home opener was against the Washington Redskins, saw a rabid sellout crowd who, like many, focused more on their anger towards Al Davis than on the game itself. His ongoing legal battles with the NFL were taking up many headlines. However, the Raiders were still cheered very heavily as Kenny King had a breakout game, 25 carries for 136 yards. The Raiders scraped by, however, with a 24-21 win. Pastorini wasn't exactly a thrill ride in this game, or to Raiders fans, he threw 3 more interceptions. The Raiders followed that up with an utterly disgraceful performance against the Buffalo Bills, losing 24-7. As the Bills had 340 yards of offense, Pastorini was 10 for 20 with 2 interceptions. The Raiders just had 228 yards of offense and were decimated on time of possession. After his first 4 games, Pastorini was heavily lambasted for his performance, despite his strong debut and a half-decent follow-up. But again, decent was all he was in the grand scheme of things. Raiders fans didn't really care for him. His 889 passing yards were nothing terrible, but he was completing less than half of his passes and was averaging 2 interceptions a game. Not good, and this is exactly what many pundits predicted. Again, they feel this trade was still out of spite, as if the Oakland faithful needed even more reasons to hate Al Davis. Other new arrivals such as Bob Chandler were doing well. He was their top receiver at this point, and Chris Barr was a good kicker. Cedric Hardman was actually playing well on the defensive line, despite not starting many games. On October 5th, Week 5 of the season, facing the lowly Kansas City Chiefs, who had the absolute worst offense in the league. Yet their defense was decimating the Raiders as a 16-yard fumble return after Pastorini was sacked, then Casey's formidable running game allowed them to take a 14-0 lead. But then something happened. Something nobody expected. Pastorini's season came to an end. He was hit after throwing a pass and suffered a fractured tibia and severe cartilage damage in his knee. Now enter Jim Plunkett. And just who is Jim Plunkett? Well, he was a Heisman Trophy winner in 1970, was touted to be the next big thing in football, the quarterback of the 70s, taken first overall by the New England Patriots. Plunkett was considered to be somewhat of a bust, however, in the vein also of teammate Dan Pastorini. His accuracy wasn't the best. In his rookie year, he did tie for second in the league for touchdowns, though a year later, he was dubiously second in the NFL for interceptions. He dubiously being the top 3 among interception leaders from 72 to 74. But was second in the league in passing yards in 73, and in 74 gave the Patriots their first winning record since the AFL-NFL merger. Plunkett only played in 5 games in 1975, and he was abysmal. It's needless to say he didn't live up to expectations, but the Patriots' problems went beyond him, to be fair. At this point, I'd say he was ranked somewhere between a Matt Stafford and a Ryan Leaf. Stafford, who wasn't a complete bust, racked up great numbers and had some really good seasons, still didn't become the star he was touted to be, even though he has now had a highly successful career. Ryan Leaf, well, he just plain sucked. But Plunkett tried to revive his career in San Francisco, and it looked like he was going to rebound. And he got the team out to a good start, but they faltered. He still had issues with interceptions. Even though his completion percentage saw a slight improvement, the team was worse the next year. Now he was considered a complete bust. He went to the Raiders in 1978 and didn't throw a single pass, as he warned the bench for Stabler, and threw only 15 passes in 1979. He still hasn't started a single game since donning the Raiders uniform. At 32 years old, Plunkett was merely a utility guy. Some now at this point have deemed him the biggest bust in NFL history. But Mark Wilson wasn't ready, and Plunkett at least had experience. Well, the Chiefs went out 31-0 and never looked back. And for a guy who's thrown just 16 passes in 3 seasons, he did all he could, but he was clearly rusty. I mean, he threw 32 incompletions, but it's still a pretty decent 238 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an abysmal 5 interceptions. The Raiders look doomed going forward. The Raiders were 2-3 to start the season. They had just lost to a team with one of the worst offenses in the league. They had lost the quarterback they had spent a lot to acquire, and now had to rely on a guy who hadn't started a game since 1977. And to top it off, they had to host the powerful Chargers. The experts and analysts say the Raiders were pretty much done, that they were no longer middle of the road, that they just simply were not going to make the playoffs. Also, the offensive line took some flack. Well, in 5 games, they had allowed 16 sacks. That's above 3 a game. And veterans Upshaw and Shell, of course, were taking the flack as, quote, aging stars. But the line as a whole was having trouble coming together. So here we go. It's Plunkett versus Fouts in what would be Plunkett's first start since December 18th, 1977. The Chargers, of course, were heavy favorites, big surprise, even with the game being in Oakland. And Plunkett only threw 14 passes, but he completed 11 of them. And the offensive line seemed to tighten up a little bit, or maybe they just communicate better with Plunkett. And the Raiders' running game was 217 total yards, with King obtaining 138 of them. A 38-24 win, as the secondary gave Fouts a lot of headaches. The defense was still hot, and now the offense, well, looked like it might finally become cohesive. But then another trade took place, one that nobody saw coming. Dave Casper, who was still racking up some good numbers at the tight end position, was actually scapegoated for the team's blocking issues as well. There was another deal to, you guessed it, Houston. They sent the star tight end to the Oilers on October 14th, in exchange for a first-round draft pick and a second-rounder in 1981, for a second-rounder in 1982 to boot. Well, you know what? Time to jump a bit. The first-round pick was Ted Watts. Didn't really pan out too much. Jumping to 1982, their second-rounder, Jack Squirek, had a famous moment, but nearly didn't pan out other than that. But back to 1981, that second-round draft pick, future Hall of Fame defensive end, Howie Long. The Raiders spun the NFL for a loop, with the win over the Chargers was the first of 6 in a row. 2 interceptions for Hendricks, and 3 touchdown passes from Plunkett led him to a huge 45-34 win over the 2-time defending Super Bowl champions, the Steelers. Now it's another 3 touchdowns for Plunkett, 2 more picks, this time from Lester Hayes, in a dominant 33-14 win over division rival Seattle. The Raiders defense goes to work even more, limiting the Dolphins to under 200 yards of offense in a 16-10 win. Otis McKinney had 2 interceptions as the Raiders as a whole had 4 in a 28-17 win over the Bengals. Then a late clutch field goal by Chris Barr gave them another win over the Seahawks. And Jim Plunkett called one of the biggest busts in NFL history by a news reporter earlier that year. Not having started a game in nearly 3 years, was playing the best football of his career, it seemed. In these 6 games, he had 1,161 yards, completing 63.2% of his passes. This is a guy who barely completed half the passes in his career at this point. He had 9 touchdowns, 6 picks. He was leading this team and becoming immensely popular in Oakland, a working-class hero with his story. In the backfield during this winning streak, both Kenny King and Mark Van Egan were a double threat and combining for over 600 yards rushing, and Egan was adding to the blocking. Veteran Cliff Branch, who had been called quote-unquote washed up by some, and Bob Chandler under one of those quote-unquote wasted trades during this streak, were Plunkett's go-to guys and delivering on a high level. In the first 5 games of the year, the offensive line was allowing over 3 sacks a game. Now they had improved, allowing just under 2 on average. The Raiders' defense up front had become more threatening, but it's their secondary and play against the pass has been remarkable. The team had 15 picks in this winning streak. 1/3 of them went to Lester Hayes during this win streak. He was having a career year. The Raiders were shockingly 8-3, leading their division over the favored Chargers, but it was still a very tight race, as the Raiders prepared to face one of the best teams in the league, the Philadelphia Eagles, who were dominating the league at 10-1, were led by quarterback Ron Jaworski, and he was having a career year as well, and coached by the very unique yet brilliant Dick Vermeil. Well, the Raiders' win streak came to a screeching halt. The Eagles' insanely talented defense sacked Plunkett 8 times. He threw 26 incompletions and 2 interceptions to boot. But the Raiders' defense also gave the Eagles a hard time, but not enough. The Raiders would lose 10-7. This wasn't really the Raiders falling apart, this was simply the Eagles showing how dominant they've been. But the critics came out to play again that the Raiders would have had it easy on their win streak, despite the fact it began over a stacked Chargers team, and they had also beaten a team that had been dominating the entire league for the last 2 years and for most of the 1970s from mid to late. Nobody, however, was really prepared for what took place on December 1st, 1980. The Raiders had a huge Monday Night Football game against the Denver Broncos set to take place. But the growing headlines of Al Davis and his issues with Pete Rozelle in the NFL, his desire to move the team to LA, was making even more headlines, and the Raiders fans were mad as hell and weren't going to take it anymore. There was a planned protest where Raiders fans would wait until 5 minutes after opening kickoff to enter the stadium with a Save Our Raiders sign. It was estimated in this game that 2/3 of the stadium was empty on opening kickoff. They also planned to flash those signs with 2 minutes remaining in each half. The Raiders would get back on winning track in this game, beating the Broncos in another defensive battle 9-3. The fans were out and vocal again in another home game the next week, this time against the high-powered Dallas Cowboys, as the Raiders' offense was stagnant yet again, and this time it cost them in a 19-13 loss. Now there were speculations of the team's inner turmoil affected them on the field. They had fallen to 9-5. But then on the road, they'd beat the Denver Broncos and moved to 10-5 and officially clinched the playoffs for the first time since 1977. Well, something that the majority of experts thought was even a pipe dream. But Plunkett, by hell or high water, took command and somehow did the impossible with this offense. However, they can still get a bye and win the division if they can win their final game of the year against the lowly New York Giants. But they also need the Chargers to lose. They are facing a team whose dynasty had just ended, the Pittsburgh Steelers, who will miss the playoffs, but are still a good enough team to play spoiler. Even if both the Chargers and Raiders finish with identical 11-5 records, which they would if they both win, the Chargers would take first place due to a better stat of net points in division games. Mark Van Egan's 115 yards on the ground and another huge day from Lester Hayes, snagging an interception and returning it 50 yards, gave the Raiders a fairly easy 33-17 win over the New York Giants on the road. But now they had to play the waiting game, and they had to wait a whole day as the Steelers and Chargers game was set for Monday Night Football. The Chargers defense shut down the Steelers' ground game, while their running back Chuck Muncie scampered for 115 yards, had a big night from Fouts throwing over for 300 yet again. The Chargers win 26-17 and take the West Division. Again, this brought out doubt, not because of the typical reasons we heard all year, but because of history. Since the inception of the Super Bowl, the prior 14 games, the 1975 Cowboys are the only team to make it the championship as a wild card playoff team, but of course they lost to the Steelers. No other wild card club has even made it, let alone win it. Be that as it may, the Raiders are back in the playoffs, but nobody's really given them too much of a chance. And look who they're facing in the wild card round. Many former players, that is. The Houston Oilers, of course. Ken Stabler, the hero of Raider Nation, had a pretty good year in some statistics, but the story, of course, was Earl Campbell, the star running back who dominated the NFL with 1,934 yards rushing, and was the Offensive Player of the Year. And they had some damage on defense as well, with linebacker Robert Bazile and cornerback Greg Stemrick. The Raiders players now on this team are doing pretty well, especially Dave Casper, but nothing near what they had done in Oakland. In a big shock, Earl Campbell fumbled on the first play from scrimmage, setting up a Chris Barr field goal. However, Stabler engineered a drive with some big passes, and eventually Campbell made up for his folly with a touchdown, giving Houston a 7-3 lead after one quarter. The Raiders just couldn't move the ball, and the Oilers had trouble getting back into field goal range in the second quarter. But Plunkett finally made a huge play, with Kenny King and a 37-yard reception, eventually setting up Todd Christensen in the end zone for a touchdown. The Raiders led 10-7. The Oilers looked to take command of the game in the third quarter, and it was controlling the clock. However, Lester Hayes signed an interception in the end zone. Neither team put points on the board, and it was 10-7 after 3. Plunkett was throwing some bad passes in this game, but in the fourth quarter, 2 shocking big plays that stunned the Oilers. A 33-yard pass to Branch, and then a 44-yard pass, this one to Arthur Whittington, which was a touchdown, 17-7 Raiders. Barr added a field goal, and the Raiders were running away with it, and late in the game, the icing on the cake, who else but Lester Hayes, intercepting a pass deep in the Oilers zone and returning it 20 yards for the touchdown. 27-7, Raiders win. Stabler in many ways statistically outplayed Plunkett, but yes, in 10 seasons this is Plunkett's first playoff game, and he made it count. He only completed 8 passes, but made each and every one of them count in a big way. Stabler threw 2 interceptions. Both were very costly. And again, showing what I said when Elway faced Favre in the Super Bowl back in one of my previous videos, you don't need to outplay someone in order for your team to beat them. So now we're off to the Afc Divisional Playoffs. Despite the dominant win over Houston, certain things about that game meant the Raiders weren't being given much of a chance against the Cleveland Browns, especially what was nearly a minus 20 degrees Celsius weather wind chill factor. It was going to be the coldest game in the NFL playoffs since the infamous 1967 Ice Bowl between the Packers and Cowboys. The Raiders were given no chance. And I have to say, there was good reasons why the Browns were favored. They were a superb club. They were led by quarterback and league MVP that year, Brian Sipe. Also star tight end Ozzie Newsome, veteran receiver Reggie Rucker, as well as David Logan. Up front, they had an offensive line led by Pro Bowl center Tom DeLeon and future Hall of Famer guard Joe DeLamolor. There it is. DeLamolor. Yeah, okay. They all kept Sipe very well protected, as well as 1,000-yard rusher Mike Pruitt. On the other side of the ball, the Browns' defensive line was led by future Raider, the great Lyle Alzado, and outside linebacker Clay Matthews Jr. And not to mention a solid secondary, he had a pretty good defense. It's game time. The dog pound was barking and ready for the Browns to make the long-awaited return to the promised land. Their last major championship was 1964. The frigid temperatures were getting to both teams, however, as punts and interceptions that ultimately led nowhere were part of this first quarter, as Hayes continued to shine. Well, a missed field goal by the Browns, a fumble by Plunkett, another missed field goal. This game was becoming quite ugly. It wasn't until 6:02 remaining in the second quarter, Ron Bolton snagged his second interception of the day and returned it 42 yards for a touchdown, and the dog pound was roaring with joy. However, the Raiders stepped up big when Hendricks blocked the extra point, but be that as it may, the Browns still led 6-0. Plunkett was playing a brutal game so far, but he finally went to work, as he worked with Chandler as well as Ray Chester to move the ball all the way to the goal line, leading to Van Egan to score with 18 seconds left in the half. It's 7-6 Raiders. They go into the break with momentum. The Browns took the lead with a field goal in the third quarter, 9-7, but then a botched snap on a field goal attempt caused the Browns a chance to patent the lead. But their next attempt was good, and they led 12-7 going into the final quarter. The way the Raiders were moving the ball didn't look very good for them. But from his own 20, Plunkett went to work. Ray Chester, who was playing a great game, got a huge 27-yard pass, and the Raiders were at the goal line. And Van Egan adds another 1-yard TD plunge. The Raiders lead 14-12, but the game was far from over. However, the clock kept winding down, and the Raiders' defense was all over the Browns. And the game looked to be over. Sipe fumbled on his own 24. The Raiders now have a chance to put this game out of reach, but they can't. The Browns' defense comes out huge with a big stop on 3rd and 1, and then 4th and 1. They get the ball back on turnovers. Sipe was a machine suddenly. 2 big completions to Newsom and Pruitt, and a big run from Pruitt got the Browns to the 14-yard line of the Raiders. The Browns on 2nd and 9 called a timeout. Then, it would become one of the most infamous play calls of all time. Red right, 88. Browns coach Sam Rutigliano, the NFL's Coach of the Year in 1980 no less, called this play, instructing Sipe, if nobody was open, throw it to the quote-unquote blonde in the front row. Yes, I know I'm saying quote-unquote a lot in this video, bear with me. His intention was to give the team one last chance to score a touchdown, before running the ball on 3rd down to run out the clock some more to lead to the eventual field goal. Well, Sipe took the snap. Newsom looked to have a good spot in the back of the end zone. The pass is up. It's caught by Lester Hayes. Haha! Raiders win! Raiders win! Yes, even people who weren't born back then in Cleveland are liking to want to beat you with your own shoes if you ever say to any of them, Red Right 88. The Raiders are back in the AFC Championship. Neither QB was overly spectacular, but again, Plunkett made the big plays. The MVP of these playoffs has clearly to be Lester Hayes, coming up huge when it matters most. But here the doubters come, right? Pointing out the Browns ultimately defeated themselves, and the Raiders just happen to benefit. Well, all I know is the Raiders are just one step away from becoming only the second wildcard team in the Super Bowl era to make the big game. But here's the Chargers. The Raiders looked like it was about to run out. But are people forgetting they split the season series and it took a thrilling OT win in the second game of the season for the Chargers to win, and the Raiders' big turnaround began with the win over the Chargers this year? Oh, but people didn't seem to think that matters, and in the grand scheme of things, it might not have. And yes, the Chargers were a cut above. Dan Fouts was perhaps the smartest quarterback in the league. Wideouts Charlie Joyner and John Jefferson each had over 1,000 yards, the latter of whom led the league with over 1,300. Then he had tight end Kellen Winslow, who also had over 1,000 yards. As a matter of fact, he had close to 1,300 and was among league leaders. Fouts set an NFL record with over 4,700 yards passing. Plus, you got running back Chuck Muncie, who had 659 yards in just 11 games rushing. And their defense, well, wasn't too shabby, especially that amazing defensive line, the best in the league. Louis Kelcher, Gary Johnson, and future Hall of Famer Fred Dean. And the Raiders' offensive line, despite improvements as the season went on, still had its weak points, and this defensive line could really break through it. The elements were much different this time, however, the complete 180 from the city of Cleveland. It was a warm, yet cloudy 22 degrees Celsius. I know, give me a break, I'm Canadian! The Raiders looked dead focused, however. On the second play from scrimmage, a pass from Plunkett to Kenny King bounced out of King's hands, but into the hands of Ray Chester, who bolted to the end zone for 65 yards, a huge start and a big 7-0 lead. It looked like Fouts was ready to counter as he hit Ron Smith on a 55-yard pass to get them deep into Raiders territory. But pesky Lester Hayes records his 5th pick of these playoffs, and the Raiders just can't capitalize on this one, however, and eventually Fouts does find Charlie Joyner later on from 48 yards out. The game is tied 7-7. But Plunkett wasn't rattled, and neither were the Raiders as a whole. On a 3rd and 20 play, Plunkett completed a huge 48-yard pass to Cliff Branch, and eventually it led to Plunkett himself running to the end zone for 5 yards out. The Raiders take a 14-7 lead. The Chargers were forced to punt, and the Raiders started on the Charger 49, and 4 plays later, Plunkett hits King 20 yards out, 21-7. And that's how the first quarter would end, and the 52,000 fans at Jack Murphy Stadium and viewers across TV land were stunned. The Chargers in the second quarter looked to begin getting back in the game, but Fouts was intercepted by little-used Burgess Owens. And then Chargers back Mike Thomas fumbled, and Hendricks recovered on the Chargers 29. Plunkett hit Branch with a 26-yard catch, setting up Van Egan running in from 3 yards out. It's 28-7 Raiders. But Fouts finally got his head in the game and engineered a smart drive. Just 1:05 left in the half, Fouts find Joyner to cut the lead to 28-14. But still many were shocked the Raiders were even in this much in control. In the second half, Fouts led the charge, pardon the pun. But 2 drop passes to the end zone meant they had to settle for a field goal, but they still cut the gap to 11. The Chargers, however, kept it going as their defensive line just pummeled Plunkett. 6 sacks overall, several other hits in this game. Then after a punt return led to the Raiders 41, it eventually led to Muncie scoring a 6-yard touchdown a few plays later. Now the Chargers only trailed by 4, 28-24. But the Raiders extended the lead to a touchdown after a 27-yard field goal from Barr. He then hit a 33-yarder in the fourth, and the Raiders then led by 10, which is 9:46 to play. The Chargers were able to get a field goal back to cut the lead to 7. The Chargers were killing the Raiders, however, on time of possession at this point. You can see the Raiders' defense was getting exhausted. Plunkett had to keep control of the clock, and he did just that. There was still nearly 7 minutes to go, lots of time for a comeback here. He engineered a series of plays, including 2 first-down scrambles, and kept the clock running, and eventually time ran out on the Chargers. The final score, 34-27. The Raiders become the second wildcard team to make the Super Bowl. After all the hardship, doubt, questionable decisions, behind-the-scenes turmoil, the Raiders have shocked the football world. There wasn't much hope for a playoff berth, let alone a wildcard berth, and a wildcard berth now going to the Super Bowl. Plunkett played a smart game and again made plays to make magic happen. Lester Hayes and the Raiders' secondary were just unbelievably brilliant. And here we go, Super Bowl 15. The Raiders would have to face the favored Philadelphia Eagles, but the odds makers only had Philly favored by just 3 points, meaning they weren't writing off this Raiders team. After all, they still did believe, to be fair, that their luck would still run out. They remembered that Philly's defense decimated the Raiders, yet they only won by a score of 10-7 in their regular season meeting this year. And the Eagles were an elite club, finishing 12-4. In the mid-1970s, they were a prominent basement dweller, and they went to a contender thanks to general manager Jim Murray and the brilliant football mind and coaching prowess of Dick Vermeil. Also, you had Ron Jaworski, who I mentioned earlier was the team's pivot. He is affectionately known as Jaws. He had one of the best touchdown-interception ratios in the entire league. He also had future Hall of Fame receiver Harold Carmichael, as well as veteran Charlie Smith, who had a career year. And to top it off, star running back Wilbert Montgomery. And a vicious defensive line led by Charlie Johnson, future Hall of Fame defensive end Claude Humphrey. The Eagles had the number 1 ranked defense in the entire league, and it was easy to see why. These guys, along with linebackers Fran LeMaster and Jerry Robinson, helped their defense number 2 against the rush. It's easy to see why on paper they are the favorites, and they had a character depth secondary that was 5th in the league against the pass. But now let's take the time to see why the Raiders are being taken just a little more seriously now. Let's look at their rankings this year. The offense, well, they were 7th the year prior, and now they're 7th again this year. They made a vast improvement in their rushing game. They were 10th on the rush, and they were 19th in passing. A slight drop, let's just say, actually quite a significant drop, as last year they were 7th in passing. Be that as it may, however, Plunkett still came up in the clutch and was a born winner, 9-2 as a starter, had a career-high 72.9 passer rating. Also, let's look on the defense. The defense was vastly improved as well, mainly thanks to Lester Hayes, who led the NFL in interceptions with 13, and the Raiders as a whole led the league with 35. Well, the Raiders were 10th overall in defense, up from 18th the year before. Against the pass, they were 19th, a slight improvement over 21. I know you're thinking they led in interceptions. Well, they did give up some yardage. However, they were 5th against the rush, a huge step up from 20th the year prior. Unbelievable. Hayes was awarded the NFL's Defensive Player of the Year due to his league-leading 13 interceptions and the first Raider to ever win the award. He'd actually be the only Raider until Khalil Mack in 2016 to obtain the honor. Jim Plunkett received a huge honor of his own, being awarded the Comeback Player of the Year. 2 years he barely took any snaps and hadn't started a game in nearly 3, and was thrust into a situation where nobody would at him due to him being talented but not reliable. He went 9-2, as I said, and he definitely deserved this award. Defying the odds once again. They snagged 4 Pro Bowl selections. Kenny King proved he was a steal of the trade, making it to his first and what would be his only Pro Bowl appearance. And then Ray Guy made his 7th and final Pro Bowl appearance, as well as Art Shell making his 8th and final. And Lester Hayes got his first what would be 5 straight. The Raiders still had a very good season. It far exceeded every expectation before Super Bowl 15 from the Superdome in New Orleans commenced. They had already defied the odds, but they didn't want to settle for that. They wanted to win the whole damn thing, finishing off an improbable season by winning the big game, even though no wildcard team ever had it in the league's history. Plunkett versus Jaworski was a QB showdown. Well, so far the Raiders have gotten past Stabler, the former god of Oakland, Brian Sipe, the best QB of that year MVP-wise, and one of the all-time greats in Dan Fouts. Now they face another Pro Bowl quarterback who had a career year. So here we go. January 25th, 1981. New Orleans, Louisiana, the Superdome, crowd of over 76,000 strong. The Raiders are dead focused and hyped. For the remaining talent from Super Bowl 11, this could be their chance for one more. For those veterans they traded for, who spent years on teams going nowhere, this could be their last chance for a winner. For the young guys like Kenny King, a huge opportunity early in his career. And for Plunkett, to complete one of the NFL's greatest redemption stories. The game was underway. Jaws had averaged less than an interception a game all year. But in his first pass of the game on the Eagles' first drive, Rod Martin intercepted the pass and returned it to the Eagles' 30-yard line. It later led to a 2-yard pass from Plunkett to Cliff Branch. The Raiders drew first blood. It looked like the Eagles might be able to respond as Jaws hit a 40-yard touchdown pass to Rodney Parker, or so it seemed. It was nullified by an illegal motion penalty, and the Raiders still led 7-0. They ended up punting. Some say in any given game in sports, there's always that one big play, that turning point, that legendary moment. One that will always stand out about anything before or after happens. And with the Raiders on third down on their own 20 in the first quarter, it happened. Plunkett took the snap. He had trouble finding an open man, as the Raiders' offensive line did all they could to protect their quarterback, but he began to scramble as Eagles linemen were coming at him. He finally found an open Kenny King, about 20 yards away, who caught it, avoiding Herman Edwards, who was trying so hard to play to win the game, and ran with all his might, however, eluding all Eagles defenders, and completed an 80-yard touchdown play. King makes it to the end zone, the longest passing touchdown play in Super Bowl history. 14-0 Raiders after one. Jaws responded by completing 22 and 25-yard passes on the next drive, in the second quarter that is, but they had to settle for a field goal and it still cut the Raiders' lead at 14-3. The Raiders were driving, but Barr missed a field goal from 45 yards out. The Eagles had a chance to cut the gap to 8 when Tony Franklin attempted a 28-yard field goal, but here's Hendricks, like he did in that convert attempt with the Cleveland Browns in the second round. He blocked the kick and the Raiders still led 14-3, and they took that lead into halftime. The Raiders didn't waste any time, however, in the third quarter. Plunkett, like he had done all year, was killing it on the long ball. A 32-yard pass to Bob Chandler early in the third quarter led to a huge touchdown to Cliff Branch from 29 yards out. Branch's second TD of the game, 21-3 Raiders. The Eagles were spinning their wings. The Eagles, however, started to look good later on in the quarter, but on 3rd and 3 on the Raiders' 34, Martin snagged his second interception of the game. Barr, making up for his earlier miss, made a field goal from 46 yards out, 24-3 after 3 quarters. Well, Jaworski finally worked his magic in the fourth quarter. He completing passes of 43 and 19 yards, leading ultimately to an 8-yard touchdown pass to tight end Keith Kriffel with enough time to make a comeback, still down 24-10. The Raiders engineered a smart drive leading to another field goal by Barr, and 2 more turnovers, however, by the Eagles, Martin obtaining his 3rd pick of the game, and they'd hang on. 27-10 final score. Oakland Raiders, Super Bowl champions. Indeed, what a moment it was. The Cinderella story made it all the way to midnight without turning into the proverbial pumpkin. Instead, it turned into a Lombardi Trophy presentation, where Commissioner Pete Rozelle likely had to grit his teeth and smile, handing it over to Al Davis. Plunkett was brilliant, and the Raiders played a strategic game on both sides of the ball and capitalized on their biggest chances and made every Eagles mistake costly to them. And the fact that this man, Plunkett, called a has-been, even a never was by some, was now going to be wearing a Super Bowl ring on his finger and a Lombardi trophy he could place right next to his Heisman. They started on paper as a middle-of-the-road team who might make the playoffs. They made what seemed bad deal after bad deal, especially for, again, that term, once again, a middle-of-the-road quarterback. But made some other deals that also seemed questionable, but ultimately ended up benefiting them. After their 2-3 start and that quarterback getting injured, well, they were being deemed not to make the playoffs now. They had to rely on a 32-year-old backup who had a couple decent years in the league but was considered one of the biggest busts in NFL history despite that. He led them to the promised land, and with quirky safety Lester Hayes leading a superb secondary, become the first team in NFL history to be a wildcard playoff club and win the big game. And in the 41 Super Bowls since, it has only happened 6 times. And of course, the pick for Super Bowl MVP, yes indeed, Jim Plunkett. Yeah, he only threw 21 passes, but threw 8 incompletions. However, he made all 13 completions count huge. His big playmaking was part of what got the Raiders to where they are and what helped them win this game. Many argue it should have been Rod Martin, and you know what? You're probably right. He did deserve it. Probably more than Plunkett, but that doesn't mean Plunkett doesn't deserve it. He played his heart out, was determined to win. But the game also caused Martin to be revered as a cult hero in Oakland and among Raiders fans all over. This Raiders team had 5 members, plus a coach and a general manager, make the Hall of Fame. Gene Upshaw and Art Shell made it in 1987 and 89 respectively. Ted Hendricks made it in 1990. Well, despite his controversy, Al Davis couldn't be ignored for the good he had done, and was inducted in 1992. And then 3 long overdue inductions. Punter Ray Guy in 2014, Coach Tom Flores was inducted in 2021, and Cliff Branch was inducted in 2022, but sadly didn't live to see it and passed away in 2019. Some make arguments for Lester Hayes, but since he used the banned substance of stickum, which actually wasn't banned when he used it, and many great players did, he still gets snubbed. Go figure. Davis eventually got the Raiders moved to LA by 1982, and the team looked like they were about to fall off the radar again after failing to make the playoffs in 1981. They did bounce back huge in 82, but Plunkett was about to be demoted in favor of prospect Mark Wilson, as he was ready to take the helm, or so we thought. He was hurt, and in 1983 they had to rely on the now 35-year-old Plunkett. Well, he, now along with fellow Heisman winner running back Marcus Allen, was now joined on defense by Howie Long, veteran Lyle Alzado, who came in from Cleveland, future Hall of Fame defensive back Mike Haynes from the New England Patriots, and hey, look at that, they won another Super Bowl in 1983, but have yet to win one since. Davis moved the team back to Oakland in 1995. Oh, goody, will they ever find a home. And the team had some good seasons, including a Super Bowl appearance in 2002. Unfortunately, what followed was questionable decision after questionable decision from the owner/general manager, and the team faltered badly. On October 8, 2011, Al Davis suddenly passed away at the age of 82. His son Mark Davis now owns the team that is now known as the Las Vegas Raiders. Yes, they moved there from Oakland in 2020. The only notable thing about Mark Davis is he has a haircut that resembled a 1990s child actor who nobody told that he could get an adult hairdo once he became one. The Raiders made the playoffs in 2021, but this team ultimately has no future. We hope you enjoyed our look at the 1980 Oakland Raiders, a team that did succeed and did have a future, winning another Super Bowl 3 years later. What other teams would you like to see us cover? Leave a comment below for suggestions. In the meantime, share the video, click like, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, I'll see ya.